a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, Memoir Nation listeners. If you haven't heard, we are hosting monthly classes at Memoir Nation featuring memoir writers and teachers who are experts in the genre and the craft. And we want to make sure you know about our next two courses because we have some really amazing memoirists who are teaching them. Maggie Smith is coming up in October, and Carvel Wallace is coming up in November. So, Brick, I think these were two of our favorite books of the past couple of years, and now it's just so amazing that they're teaching for us.
Yeah, that's right. Maggie Smith is the author of You Could Make This Place Beautiful, and Carvel Wallace wrote Another Word for Love. And Maggie will be teaching about experimenting with form, which she did so beautifully in her own memoir. And Carvel is teaching about theme, also incredibly executed in his book. So you are in for a treat. These classes are just $49. And honestly, these are some of the most talented writers of our era. I do not even say that lightly. And they have so many wonderful insights. So we are inviting you to come check it out. Come join us. Mark your calendars, October 14th for Maggie Smith and November 4th for Carvel Wallace. Really, truly, these classes are going to be worth every penny.
Absolutely. So check out the details at memoirnation.com under the classes tab and explore what we're up to while you're there. You know, we're growing Memoir Nation each and every week. So if you're looking for community and writing advice and great classes and much more, come see what we're up to. And we hope to see you on October 14 or November 4, or for both, or for the classes after that as well.
Totally. And thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. Visit memoirnation.com. And now on to today's show. Hello, creators, self-searchers, mystics, and personal growth enthusiasts. I'm Brooke Warner, here as always with Grant Faulkner. Grant, you know what? It's fun that we're old enough now that we are starting to have return guests. And we recently had Lydia Yuknevich back on the show, and now we're bringing back fan favorite Melissa Febos to talk about her new book, The Dry Season, which I'm super excited to get into. 8 looks good on us, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think 7 did, and 9 well as well, just because we're aging very, very nicely, I think. And, you know, I per having guests on multiple times, I mean, Terry Gross has had guests on 2, 3, 4 times, maybe 5 times. I think we're clearly in Terry Gross's league now.
Oh my gosh, that is obvious. Yes, I always note when she has repeat guests also. So yeah. Take note. Melissa Febos, I am a huge fan of her work. And this new book, The Dry Season, really is an intellectual tour de force. That was what was most striking about it, because I happened to read it right after I read Elizabeth Gilbert's new memoir, All the Way to the River. And it was kind of an interesting experience because Melissa is also writing about sex and love addiction in this new book, though the results of her exploration truly could not be more different. And I did find it interesting that there was this overlap, though. And then it made me think, Grant, about last week's show and how we asked Elizabeth Crane about the similarities between her book, which is called This Story Will Change, and Maggie Smith's book, which is called You Could Make This Place Beautiful. And she got to talking about zeitgeists and how sometimes that just happens, and that you have a book that will be really similar to someone else's. And of course, given the volume of books that are out in a given year, how could it not? But it did make me wonder if it has ever happened to you, that you've had something you're either working on or something that you've published and then found another book that felt uncomfortably similar.
Uncomfortably similar. I think that's the word for it. It's funny you mentioned this because I've experienced it, and I've even felt chagrined by the experience, because I kind of thought I possessed that terrain. It was just mine, more or less. And I'm thinking way back to 2009 when I first started writing these little 100-word stories in flash fiction. And the genre not only influenced my short work, but I started writing everything in this elliptical, fragmentary way, no matter if it was a novel or a memoir. And that style of storytelling, it just really suited what I'll call my more lyrical or poetic side. And I thought I just found my aesthetic and that it was my aesthetic. Except within a year or two, a bunch of other books started coming out with that aesthetic. And then more and more books came out. And even though this isn't maybe quite true, to me, it seems like every other book I pick up has a very similar kind of fragmentary aesthetic. So it was definitely a zeitgeist. A bunch of us basically got the same idea at the same time. And then that idea spread. And I just want there to be a name for this aesthetic. And then I want the Wikipedia entry to list me as one of the early practitioners.
Totally. I understand that, because I felt that way a little bit about hybrid, which is adjacent, kind of similar. But writers that I work with fret about this stuff all the time. The reality is that for readers, in fact, it rarely matters. Like per my above point, there's just so much content in the world, and a lot of us are having very parallel experiences. But writers get distraught. I also appreciate what you said, possessive, because I think it's both, and when you see a new book come out and it feels like it's covering ground that you're either writing about or that your book is about to come out on that same topic, it's like the immediate impulse is, oh, shoot. But usually I say to writers, embrace it, see if you can get that person to blurb your work, or maybe you could even possibly do an event together. And also lots of people do not just read one book on a given topic. Case in point, I read these two books back to back. A, they're very different. B, even if we didn't have the podcast, I would have read these books because I'm interested in the subject matter, and in these cases, these particular authors too. So I do think that's a good thing for writers to keep in mind. But Grant, I do want to turn our attention here to one of the many, many insights in Melissa's new book. The dry season starts with her pledge to be celibate for 3 months, which she acknowledges is kind of ridiculous. Like, she does include this funny scene where her mom is like, Melissa, you know that a lot of people go without sex for a lot longer than that without even trying. But Melissa's point is, like, for her, love addiction is dragging her under, and all of her focus is on the other. And she's done so much damage to herself and to other people because of how she operates in relationships. And so 3 months turns into a year because she discovers that absent this obsession that she has with romantic love, she's actually happier and more creative and more productive. And then, like, the point of the book, in my opinion, is that in solitude, she really thrives. Mm-hmm. And Grant, you and me are parents, and we're both married. But even in marriages, and even when you're a parent, it is possible to carve out solitude. And I know that you do. You talk about it with your trips and other things that you do. So I'm just curious, what's your relationship to solitude? And is solitude an inherently creative space for you?
What a great question. And I think one of the great strengths of my relationship with Heather, and really one of our requirements for each of us, is that we would give each other a lot of room. So we'll go on separate writing retreats, or I'll go on road trips or other travels. And that's largely because we both like time alone, and we both need to nurture our creativity in different ways. And one of my favorite ways just happens to be in a car driving cross country, totally alone. At this point, I'm so fixed in my weird way of traveling that I don't think anyone could actually come with me. And I have a funny relationship with solitude because I need a lot of it, but I am also such a people person that I don't like to be entirely alone for very long. I once traveled alone in Thailand for 3 weeks, and I really wanted a travel companion. And for me, I think I like to be in a relationship and have the option for solitude. Heather and I sometimes joke that we're together but separate. And I think we're more together than separate, but it's nice to have both. And I think it's interesting because you asked Melissa a question in the interview, and she kind of says the same things. She says, shape your relationship so that contours work for you, that they don't match with this convention of dubious origins.
I mean, I really love what you're saying. And I think people who make their relationships work find a way to do together, separate together. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's
whatever it is.
Yeah, because, it was interesting to me that this was the subject of Melissa's book that most fascinated me, was her exploration of solitude and her acknowledgement that she had never not been in a relationship. And in the interview, I love that she talks about her marriage and how they're making that work with that together separateness. But like me, Melissa is a serial monogamist, so I totally related to that. And even in times when I've been single, I've always wanted to be in a relationship. So I do relate to that being a focus. And so in this year of celibacy that she gets into, it wasn't so much about letting go of sex, but really letting go of a particular fixation. And that did make sense to me from my personal experience and experiences with friends, that focusing on being in partnership really can be all consuming, especially when a relationship is newer. And some people are just addicted to that newness. But she has this creative year of exploration, and she writes about what it's like to be alone and how it's hard, but also wonderful and deeply fulfilling. And she's reading and she's writing and she's filling her well. And I was just like longing when I was reading that, because I have so little solitude in my life right now. I mean, my ex-wife is not well. My wife and I, who I'm currently married to, we have my son full time, and, I am married, and I will say that we're super good at that too. This doing separateness together, which is one of the many reasons I think that we work, but we also have 4 demanding animals who need to be fed and walked and attended to. And I think what happens is that, a lot of people crave solitude. I know that I do, but then you get it and you feel nostalgia, or like sorry for yourself. So it's this very weird, like double-edged sword. But I wanted to share this great poem from our friend Julie Barton, who wrote the book Dog Medicine. She has this incredible Substack where she's writing a poem a day, and it's called Out with Lanterns. But this poem kind of spoke, I thought perfectly spoke to this. So, she's a recent empty nester. And so the poem goes, it's called Upon My Release. It seems I am going kicking and screaming into this this life where I have time for myself, where I can decide how to spend my day. It is a kind of twisted truth that once freedom comes, I don't know what to do with it. I wished for years for the open vistas I can see now, but all I want is to go back into the small room of the past and stay there. So I wanted to share that, Grant, because I think that's how a lot of us operate. We long and then we get what we want, and then we long for what we had.
Definitely. I like her words for it. Twisted truth, and I subscribe to her Substack as well. It's really wonderful. And that poem definitely describes me perfectly, because I have to confess that I always look forward to the time when Heather takes the kids to her parents and I get the house to myself for a whole week. And then when they leave, the house feels so deeply empty. And I find myself a little off kilter in a variety of ways. And it just makes me realize how, if I were truly alone in the world, how much practice it would take just to essentially rewire my brain and get used to it. And then how I would have to be just much more strategic about getting out and seeing people every day. And as I said, I'm a loner and a people person, which is just such a paradox. And my 3 weeks in Thailand that I mentioned just showed me that it's much more fun to have people with you when you're experiencing new things and getting new thoughts. So somehow you have to strike that balance.
Absolutely. Isn't that so true? And, before we get to Melissa, Grant, it needs to be said that this memoir is one of those very modern and cool memoirs that's as much an exploration of thought and history and ideas as it is Melissa's experience. And I want to preface this because we talk about it in the interview, that she writes about saints and mystics and feminists and all these texts. I mean, it's just really interesting. Sometimes she's a meta narrator and she writes in her book about what she's doing, like her own writing and her own process, which is funny to me because I recently wrote a Substack in which I implored writers not to do that. But the reason I really don't like it when I read stuff from more beginning writers is because it feels often very clunky. And it's like a little bit the writer trying to process their own experience of writing the book. But in the hands of someone like Melissa Febos, it's different, in part because she's a skilled writer and in part because she teaches writing. And I did just want to say that because this book is like got a lot of interesting stuff going on. It's about so much more than just Melissa's year of celibacy. So we're going to get into many, many topics and ideas. And she's just such a smart interview. So stay tuned. We will be right back after this short musical respite.
Well, Brooke, I'm always so pleased when we have a sponsor whose products and services I've actually used and enjoyed independently. And that's the case with Gotham Writers Workshop. I took my first class with them nearly 20 years ago, and it was an online class, my first online class ever. And I had my MFA at the time, and I have to say that my Gotham class was as good as any of my MFA classes. And in fact, the great writer Manuel Gonzalez taught it. But it wasn't just about Manuel. All of the students in the course were super smart and really good writers. And amazingly enough, I'm still in touch with some of them. So I wholeheartedly recommend taking any of Gotham's courses.
I love that so much. And Gotham definitely has a high pedigree and it's been around for a long time. They offer creative writing classes in New York City, but also over Zoom, and also asynchronous classes that you can take online. And so you can be anywhere in the world. And they have an amazing breadth of offerings, Grant. They offer memoir classes, woohoo, but also other nonfiction, as well as fiction, poetry, songwriting, and many others, and with super qualified instructors and for an affordable price.
Yeah. And as I mentioned mentioned, they are very much about community. So you can stay involved with Gotham in a number of ways. And they even put on conferences. And writers often ask me how to find a writing group or a beta reader. And I think taking a class is a great way to find good writing partner matches. So develop your craft and join a vibrant community of writers at Gotham Writers Workshop.
Yes, you can find them at gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting. Use our code, please, Memoir Nation at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply there, but definitely go check it out. And so endorse them, Grant.
Yeah. So one more time, visit gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting soon and use the code Memoir Nation, all one word, Memoir and Nation with no space between them, at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply. And tell them that Grant sent you, and Brooke too.
Welcome back, everyone. We have Melissa Febos with us today. Melissa is the author of 5 books, including the national bestselling essay collection, Girlhood, which has been translated into 10 languages and won the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. Her craft book, Body Work, was also a national bestseller and an LA Times bestseller. Her new memoir, The Dry Season, was just published in June from Knopf. She holds an MFA from Sarah Lawrence College and is the Roy J. Carver Professor at the University of Iowa, where she teaches in the Nonfiction Writing Program. Also, welcome back, Melissa. This is actually your second time on this show.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're so thrilled. I mean, The Dry Season is really a tour de force, so huge congratulations as a starting point.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I really, really loved it. And so I did want to start by asking you about this lens of celibacy and the idea that in memoir, we do have a container when we choose our theme or our themes. And so celibacy is a theme, but it touches so much other stuff, including solitude and love addiction and creativity. And so I wanted to open with this question of choosing celibacy as a theme, having it as a container, and then, what helped you to hold all of the work that you were trying to put into that container, if that's how you think about it or otherwise.
A lot of people talk about theme. My students are obsessed with theme, but I don't think I'm really guided by it. I'm guided by more of a kind of inchoate drive toward certain experiences or subjects, and I have learned to trust it, right? And so when it comes to my book topics, I almost never feel like I choose them. It feels much more like they choose me, and I write to find out what my subject matter is. And I think given from that first half of that answer, you would think that I'm just sort of like writing into the wild and like not planning, but I'm actually a very circumscribed writer. I do a lot of notes and outlines and research, and a lot of planning goes into my work. But it just so happened that drive was oriented toward this year that I spent celibate. So I didn't necessarily think that it would be a book about celibacy or that it would be about anything else. I thought, wow, it's just... I clearly have some unfinished business in this area of my life. And I also had the reference point that during that time period, I had read a lot about, I was experiencing my own celibacy, and I was also reading about other celibate folks across history, and found this really startling sense of connection with those figures. And I guess when you're researching things and undergoing experiences for your own edification and growth, there isn't as much of an impetus to articulate them explicitly. It's like, I will take as little understanding as necessary for me to like be happier and move forward in my life. I don't need to have it all laid out exactly in a diagrammatic way, but when you're writing a book, one does have to make those understandings really explicit. And so for me, it really was sort of putting words for the first time to some of the big takeaways of that time period. And I mean, it was as surprising to me as it is to many readers that the book ended up being about so many other things, as much or more so than it is a book about celibacy.
Well, Melissa, I'm really intrigued by your research. Sounds like it was really your reading that you just went down these paths and became obsessed or very interested in these figures, because you have so many citations in this work, and which is just incredible. And much of the writing that you research for this book is from very old texts and religious and mystical texts. And you write about, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this right, but the Beguines.
The Beguines.
The Beguines, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Who were lay religious women in medieval Western Europe. And you write about Hildegard and St. Catherine of Siena and Marjorie Kemp, who you note wrote the first English language autobiography. And so I'm curious if we could go a step further and you could talk more about this impulse to research these women and to include them in your work in the way that you do, and that they're woven throughout nearly every chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, happy to. I think I've answered a lot of questions about incorporating research into my work. And once again, I think this really sort of happens as an organic outgrowth of my own thought process. I'm just like a bookish, nerdy person. Even as a child, I had a lot of experiences, a lot of sort of acute experiences that I feared and wondered if I was alone in. And because I was afraid of revealing myself to other people or shy of that, I always went to books to find common experience, right? So I was looking for evidence of my own personal experience, either interior or exterior, in novels and stories and poems and plays and works of psychology or history, right? And I think that impulse has been pretty preserved and maintained over the course of my life as an adult writer. And so, when I first started researching these celibate women, I was celibate myself. I had no plans to write about it. And I was really just groping for insight into my own condition, which was that I had been in a very long series of love affairs that had ended me up in a very dark place. And given that I had spent decades in therapy and read a lot and had a really big emotional vocabulary, I had thought I was really good at relationships. And so I was just trying to figure out what the hell had happened, And so I started reading. And I'll tell you, or maybe you already know, the comfort of locating your own experience in a text or a voice that is incredibly distant, whether it's sort of temporal or geographical or class or identity, it doesn't matter, that is incredibly far away from your own experience, someone that you would never intersect with, it's such a profound comfort, right? To be reading like Lacan and think, oh my God, that teaches me something. I recognize something about my experience as a 12-year-old girl growing up in coastal Massachusetts in the early 90s, it's just that I'm never, ever alone in any kind of experience. And so I went looking for that in these medieval women. And then, I nurtured a relationship to them that lasted from the time I was celibate, which was now almost 10 years ago, all the way up until the point I was writing the book. And so those relationships existed on the page and were an intrinsic part of that story that I could never have. It would have felt like a really grave omission to leave them out of it, because they had sort of been my companions in all my thinking about that time period.
I love that a lot. It's and it is so seamless. And I guess I want to build from that a bit more, because there's one point in the book where you reference how novelist and poet Robert Gluck used Marjorie Kemp as a sort of muse in one of his books. And you talk about him writing in tandem with her, even though he's a modern writer and she lived in the 15th century. And then following this, you reference this idea of the meta-narrator, and you write a bit about your own process. And I'm just going to quote you. You say, I am doing the same thing here, building a linear narrative, grafting other stories onto it, folding time to see the patterns. If I suggest a single meaning, it would be a lie. I read those lines like more than a few times, because it's so interesting for a writer, and unusual, by the way, to employ the meta narrator in the way that you do. We saw it recently with Maggie Smith's You Can Make This Place Beautiful. And I just wanted to ask you about that. It is narratively experimental, even risky to exit the scene and to direct the content to the reader in that way. So could you just talk about it as an intentional choice, and also as I think a little bit being done more in memoir than it used to be? I feel like it's more allowed now than it was maybe 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I do it when it feels right, when there's sort of a purpose. I am a person who loves To be swept away by narrative. I want to be captivated. One of my first motives for reading was escape, and that's still great part of the pleasure for me. So creating a narrative that has that potential is really important to me. But I also have a really profound and personal understanding of the dangers of narrative construction and of narrativizing one's own experience and submitting it to a single line of narrative, because it never exists. There are an infinite number of ways I could tell the story of any experience, right? And usually when I'm writing about it, I am looking for a particular thread of one that I've hidden from myself or that has been elided from me vis-a-vis other forces, right? Because of my social conditioning or whatever. And I think when I'm writing memoir, it is important for me to remind myself that I am building a narrative and to remain conscious of all that one must omit in order to tell an economic story, right? We have to leave. I mean, the great surprise of memoir for all first-time memoir writers is that you have to leave almost everything out. Like 300 pages seems like a really long time, but actually when you want to encapsulate an experience that is always going to be sort of infinitely prismatic, you really have to choose a tiny, tiny percentage of what you could possibly be writing about. And so it is important for me to acknowledge that within myself, and then also sometimes within the work itself. And I think I feel especially conscious of this when I am doing writing that involves other people's texts and other people's experiences, because I am using their stories and their words in ways that are different from the ways that they used them or that they might have used them, right? And so to just remain really forthright with myself and my reader about the manipulations of the writer. And I say that there's a negative connotation to the word manipulation, but storytelling is a form of manipulation. We are creating an experience for a reader and guiding them through it. I think that's my duty as a writer. But I guess I want to remain sort of transparent in that. And when I was younger, and I think maybe this goes back to what you were saying about it being more allowed now, I think we had an idea that you couldn't acknowledge that you were telling a story without puncturing the dream of the story. And I don't think that's true. I think that you can tell a really compelling story and also acknowledge all of the absences inside of that telling.
Melissa, I just want to pause a moment. I was so happy to see you referring to Robert Gluck's Marjorie Kemp.
What a book. What a filthy, beautiful book.
I know. I read it 30 years ago, of all things. He was my creative writing professor, and he's
amazing.
He's totally one of my single favorite people on the planet. And, he's just so smart, and he's also very kind and funny and generous. So super happy that you have enthusiasm for his book.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah. But on that note, you write about your students and sometimes about writing craft. And there's a part of the book where you write, and I'll quote, "There is a difference in how you react to a text and how you analyze a text. You can be attracted to or repelled by the content and still think critically about your response, about your own relationship to the text. Our work is about practicing such discernment." And this struck me because I think we're in such a moment here in this country where we're losing such discernment across the board, whether we're talking about our reactions to books, like I'm thinking of the intensity of the reaction to Elizabeth Gilbert's new memoir, or in social media posts where there seems to be no discernment whatsoever, and the loudest and least nuanced voices, kind of suck up all the air. So I think everyone needs to take a class in discernment now. And I wonder what your thoughts are on all this.
Oh, God. Let's see. Basically that passage that you read is lifted pretty much wholesale from like my notes for the first class of any semester, where I talk about critical reading and about practicing that discernment between your experience of a text or anything and what is actually in front of you. And we all struggle with this, right? And I think for a memoirist, there is an additional kind of responsibility, right? When you're examining your own past, it's an empty exercise if you are simply doing so to ratify an interpretation of your experience that makes you feel comfortable, because it makes you feel comfortable, right? And that is the great misconception that people make of memoirists, as if we're telling our stories to indulge ourselves, when in fact it's the opposite. right? We are telling our stories to confront the parts of them that make us most uncomfortable and from which we'd most like to hide, if we're doing our job right. And so, I mean, I don't know that there's even much to add about sort of the moment where we're at. We are at a nadir of critical reading facility right now. I'm sure people have said that before and felt that before, you know? And so it really is, I actually consider that work in my teaching as like very, very important work, right? Because that discernment needs to happen on the individual, on the subjective level before it can happen on any kind of national or global level, right? We have to be able to know where the threshold is between how we feel about something and what is before us, you know? And we have a really hard time doing that because it's challenging, right? And there's a lot of collaborating forces that helps ratify whatever reading we wish for, you know? But I don't think it serves us or anyone in the end, you know? There really is, I just don't believe in shortcuts, you know? I've spent a lot of my life telling myself stories that I wish were true, and I never have ever gotten away with it.
There's a quote.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you do write about that a little bit in this book. And so there's so much good stuff to unpack for memoirists in here. And, you know, this is an overexposed topic, but I feel like I have to ask it because I did read the Liz Gilbert memoir right before I read The Dry Season. Mm-hmm. So when you started to write about love addiction and this idea of the addiction narrative, I thought it was going to circle similar territory. And of course, they are not similar books at all, you know, except in this vein of allowing love and romantic excitement to sort of take over everything. And then some of that compulsive behavior you write about, you know, flirting, being smitten with complete strangers, is overlap territory. And so I am curious to know whether you read it, but more importantly is your thoughts about books that, I don't know, enter into the same zeitgeist at the same time, and, you know, what it feels like for you when something like that gets, you know, a massive amount of attention. When you've written this book that I said at the beginning, you know, to you behind the scenes, like I thought that yours was the book that really should have gotten the attention because it's so profound.
Yeah, you know, I haven't read the book, but I think that Liz is a fantastic writer. I'm a fan of hers, and I think this is something that we see all the time. I think it's happening constantly. It's why the word zeitgeist exists, you know. And I think we have gotten to a degree of familiarity with addiction narratives that we can write about the lesser represented ones, and love and sex addiction is definitely among those, you know? And so I am always in favor of a multiplicity of voices on any topic, especially underrepresented topics, you know? From what I've read about it, Liz's book is a case study in this, right? And stories of addiction are incredibly compelling, incredibly dramatic, and really, really powerful, you know? Like they're really captivating. And that is often the doorway that people need to a subject, right, is to enter at a sort of apex moment of experience, right? And writing The Dry Season, I understood my challenge, which was that I was writing about the story of what happens after the crisis, after the annihilation of self, right? What happens? What is the interior work that must happen so that a crisis does not recur? It's not an inherently dramatic process, right? I had to find ways to dramatize a story that happened largely inside of me, right? And I had to really find the places where I could concretize that story, you know? And I did, but I knew that it wasn't going to be like the grand finale of fireworks, you know? And in some ways I was surprised by the sort of inherent tension of that story and the active scenes where I did find it playing out. So, you know, I'm really grateful for the readership that the book has found. And I think, you know, my great fear was that people who were involuntarily celibate or had sort of the inverse experience of mine would be repelled by the book's topic without reading it. And surely there are plenty of those people, but I've been really, really grateful for the interactions I've had with readers who are like, I thought I had the opposite experience, but in reading the book, I realized that we actually had the same root problem. It was just expressed in different ways. And that's always my hope for the book, is that it will transcend its literal subject matter to find the readership that connects with the meaning of the book.
I'm going to shift gears here just a little bit, Melissa. Your book is as much about solitude as anything, and about time and the time you got back from loosening your obsession over potential romantic partners. And Brooke and I were talking about how little time most of us seem to have in our busy modern lives these days, and that you clawed back some of that back for yourself during this time. Seems to have opened up so much. And so now that you're married, and so I'm just curious if you're still able to cultivate solitude, and if so, how?
I am. And, it's like one always hopes that when you do work in one area of life, that it will transfer into all of the other analogous areas of life. And that just doesn't happen in my experience. I have a framework, but I still have to build those habits in every area, right? So in some ways, I think of that time as drawing the blueprint, right? I figured out what had been happening, what needed to change, and how I wanted to change it. But that was like watching videos of people dancing on YouTube and then actually hitting the dance floor, like I was not great at it at first. And so, it's interesting. I think I wrote this book at a greater distance than any other personal nonfiction, aside from maybe writing about childhood. And the book is inlaid with so many insights and experiences that happened long after that period. In fact, a lot of the book's wisdom is derived from my marriage, where I had to put that blueprint into practice, right? And, my wife and I were actually just in couples therapy this morning, sort of reflecting on how successful so many of our sort of practices have become. And foremost among those is our practice of giving each other time, right? We really had to figure out, because we're both people who need a lot of alone time. I had trouble asking for it. And we had to sort of build practices and routines into our lives that made space for the people we actually are, right? And something we were noting is that, I think we are taught to approach relationships, and particularly romantic relationships, from practice to experience trajectory. Like, if I do this thing, it'll make me feel this way. And what we've learned to do is think, okay, when do we feel really happy to see each other, right? And what is it that we do that creates that? So we're not saying, a great example is we used to sleep together every single night in the same bed because that's what happy couples did, right? But then we would wake up and be cranky at each other a lot of the time. And we got to this point, a couple of years into our relationship, where we were we should start sleeping separate sometimes. We actually both kind of like to sleep separate sometimes, especially when things are busy. And then we would wake up and be so happy to see each other in the morning. So really sort of drawing the contours of a relationship in the shape of the people that we are, instead of the sort of uniform pattern that we inherited from really dubious sources.
I love that. Everyone sleep apart sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God, I talk about it all the time. It has done amazing things for our relationship. We are so much closer now that we sleep apart a third of the time.
That makes so much sense. My gosh. Well, the final question, Melissa, is, of all the women writers, intellectuals, saints, mystics, and others that you write about in the book, who is the one that most inspired you, and why?
I'm probably going to have to say Hildegard. Oh God, I just felt like I was going to cry for a second. I just that experience of finding commonness, of finding a kind of kin, of feeling that I belonged to a lineage that was truly ancient, and also perfectly relevant to the time in which I am living, was really embodied by her. And I think part of that comes from the fact that Hildegard had an incredibly sort of traumatic childhood. And this doesn't come out of I don't actually feel like we have that in common, but that she was so clear in her vision and so faithful to her beliefs and her creativity, and really self-actualized more so than most people on this, or who have existed on this earth. And that she lived basically in confinement for the first 38 years of her life, in a prison, basically. And that she came out of that experience, that she sort of alchemized that experience into this incredibly creative, bold, peaceful, empowered, politically trenchant way of living, is just amazing to me. just like incredibly beautiful. And if she could do it in medieval times, like I could stand to be a little more faithful to the divine in me here in our year 2025.
Thank you. Beautiful answer. So grateful to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Likewise, Melissa. This is so wonderful.
We'll be right back with today's book trend.
Well, Brooke, this week's book trend is definitely disheartening, a harrowing and horrible outgrowth of our current political climate, but there is a hopeful part to this as well. So I'll start with the horrible part. It's that book banning is getting worse. By the time this airs, Penn is going to release their new report on book banning, but here are some key facts to already know, and I'm sure that the Penn report goes beyond this. The American Library Association documented 4,240 unique book titles targeted for censorship in 2023, and that represented a 65% increase from 2022's already record-breaking numbers. So book banning's on the rise, and according to PEN America, about 30% of book challenges attempts result in some form of removal or restriction, meaning that thousands of books are actually being pulled from the shelves. And guess which books are being pulled from the shelves? About 47% of the challenged books contain LGBTQ themes or characters, despite LGBTQ books representing a much smaller percentage of overall published titles, and about 31% of the challenges target books dealing with race, racism, or featuring characters of color. So I think we can read some very disturbing national storylines into this data. And the hopeful part, though, is this new film, The Librarians. And it was produced by Sarah Jessica Parker, and it features Amanda Jones, who we had on this podcast. I think it was about 6 months or a year ago. Anyway, she had a harrowing story, like the other librarians that are featured in the show. But the film shows how the power of stories can truly deliver us, because it's a documentary that's really contextualizing this in an interesting way.
Mm-hmm. And this trend is relevant to all of us. The Librarians is now set to release nationwide, beginning in New York on October 3rd. Please watch it. Go find it. It's going to run for a week in LA starting October 10th, and then it will expand to 40 cities across the country. Viewers in select cities also have the opportunity to engage in local town halls about the film, and that would be a really good way. I think a lot of people are asking right now, how can I get involved in something? How can I do activism? And so going to a town hall and making it known that you're not okay with this stuff is one really good way to do that. The film does star librarians, like you said, like Amanda Jones, who've been thrust into local and national spotlights over their commitments to the freedom to read. I do think this is great that it's a film, because this is a different kind of superhero movie, and that's what the blurb says. I think that's very clever. Much of the film covers censorship efforts in Florida and Texas, and so we have to be paying attention to this stuff. It's so important, and these stories do provide a lens into the coordinated nationwide movement that is attempting to ban books and all kinds of other stuff, Grant. I mean, we're in this moment right now where we're really starting to see some disturbing national trends that is an outgrowth, I think, of this banning. This has been going on a long time, and now it's just reaching new heights.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all connected. It's all the same thrust to sweep a lot of the dissenting voices, or not even dissenting voices. In this case, these are just basic stories about lives that we all need to read about. And I've been keeping tabs on this movie for a long time, because Canopy, the streaming service that's funding and distributing the TV show I've been working on, America's Next Great Author, its main customer is public libraries. So the 175 million public library cardholders have access to Canopy, and Canopy's been involved in this film, of course. And not only is the climate around literature for young people in the library handled well, but viewers of the film get an inside look at the, just the personal toll that the last several years have had on the lives of the film's subjects. And Amanda talked a lot about that in our interview with her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's so hard to just even exist when you're being targeted for things like this. And this is really just about standing up for people's right to read. It's crazy. So information about this film in select cities you can find on the Librarians website. We will put that in the show notes, and then you can also purchase tickets there. Each time we report on book bans on this podcast, Grant, it just is so upsetting to me. And as we're saying, it is getting worse, and it's these late night talk shows and all this stuff that we're watching. And so I feel like we've really reached an inflection point, and people are starting to feel scared and also like they don't know what to do. And so we do need to band together and support each other and find ways to get our voice out there, not be afraid to speak out. The good thing is that people listening to this podcast, we're writers. You know, this writing community has a lot of important things to say. Use your voice widely. Remember that stories do change the world. You know, it's of course personally distressing to me when I see stuff about LGBTQ plus content being banned, characters of color. You know, we need representation. We're going to keep talking about that on this podcast. So tune in. You know, we hate for our book trends to always be so distressing. And I'm glad that you mentioned this one silver lining in all of this, Grant, but we're living in distressing times. And so keep writing your story and keep saying things out loud. And we're going to be here right alongside with you. And we'll see you next week.